morning light filtered softly through the blinds as Nick tidied up the study, a Saturday ritual he had come to enjoy. As he stacked papers and dusted the bookshelves, his hand brushed against a small, glossy slip of paper peeking out from beneath a pile of unopened mail. It froze. His curiosity piqued. It was a receipt from a high-end jewelry store, dated just 2 weeks prior. The item? A bracelet worth over $3,000. Nick furrowed his brow. Amanda, his wife of 7 years, loved jewelry, but this bracelet didn't match anything he'd seen her wear, and that, he realized, was the issue. He hadn't seen her wear it at all. His meticulous nature kicked in. Setting the receipt on the desk, he pulled up their shared credit card account on his phone. He scrolled through the transactions and felt a jolt. The bracelet wasn't an isolated purchase. Over the past 3 months, there were charges for boutique clothing stores he didn't recognize, spa days she hadn't mentioned, and dinners at expensive restaurants. Yet, none of these expenses aligned with their dates or shared moments. The dots connected slowly, a puzzle piece clicking into place with each revelation. These weren't indulgences for her or their relationship. They were for someone else. Nick's heart pounded as he stared at the receipt. Amanda's charming laugh and her recent enthusiasm for late-night work meetings replayed in his mind. She'd always been the warm, loving partner who supported his long hours as an accountant. But now, a shadow loomed over every memory. Was this paranoia? Or had he stumbled onto something darker? That evening, Amanda came home with her usual vivacity, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor as she called out a cheerful, "Hey, hon!" Nick greeted her with a kiss, his mind racing behind a carefully composed face. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He needed more than a receipt. Over dinner, he observed her closely, looking for cracks in her demeanor. Amanda chatted animatedly about a client pitch and her upcoming girls' night out. Her stories flowed naturally, but Nick noticed a faint hesitation, a quick glance away when he asked for details about her week. Yeah, shit. Man, that scratch is going to start soaking in my workout. Later that night, as she drifted off to sleep, Nick stayed awake staring at the ceiling. The evidence he had wasn't definitive, but it was enough to rattle the foundations of his trust. He resolved to dig deeper. If Amanda was betraying him, he needed the truth. Not for revenge, but to reclaim control of his life. This wasn't just about a bracelet, it was about the integrity of their partnership, the life they had built together. And Nick, meticulous and methodical as ever, was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The following week, Nick transformed from husband to investigator. The shock of his discovery hardened into resolve. He needed to piece together the truth, not from suspicion, but from undeniable evidence. Amanda's actions seemed meticulously calculated. His response would need to be the same. Nick began by quietly examining her patterns. He synced their shared calendar with his phone, comparing her appointments to the timestamps on her recent purchases. Patterns emerged. Her supposed client lunches coincided with the charges for expensive restaurants, and her late nights at work lined up suspiciously with spa visits or boutique purchases. Still, nothing was conclusive. He needed something definitive. Something irrefutable. On Wednesday, when Amanda left for her girls' night out, Nick decided to follow her. Dressed in dark jeans and a nondescript jacket, he waited until her car pulled out of the driveway before slipping into his own and maintaining a cautious distance. His pulse quickened when she didn't head toward her friend Jenna's neighborhood, but instead drove downtown, stopping in front of a high-end restaurant. Is high... Nick parked a block away and walked toward the restaurant's softly lit entrance. Through the broad windows, he spotted her immediately. She wasn't with her friends. She was sitting at an intimate table for two, laughing and leaning in toward a man he didn't recognize. A tall, confident figure in his mid-30s, dressed in an expensive blazer. The man reached into his pocket, retrieving a small gift box. Nick felt his stomach churn as Amanda opened it, her face lighting up into light as she slipped a bracelet onto her wrist. The bracelet. Nick clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay rooted in the shadows. What it is? Pulling out his phone, he snapped a few discreet photos, each click of the shutter feeling like another crack in the foundation of their marriage. He watched as they toasted with wine glasses, their interaction easy and intimate. After what felt like an eternity, Amanda and the man rose from their table. Nick followed at a careful distance, keeping to the edges of the crowd. When they exited the restaurant, Amanda's hand briefly brushed the man's arm before they parted ways. He hailed a taxi, and she returned to her car. Nick's mind raced as he drove home. His photos confirmed what the receipts had suggested. Amanda was leading a double life. But there were still unanswered questions. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? He needed more answers before confronting her. The next day, Nick called in sick to work and dug deeper. Using his technical savvy, he accessed Amanda's email account. He felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside. Her actions had already crossed the line. Ready for this? Ooh, now there's all kinds of crazy shit on the internet, I said slowly. Petitions started getting emails about me. His hands trembled as he navigated her inbox. Most emails were mundane. Work correspondence, promotions, invitations to social events. But buried under an innocuous subject line, he found a chain of messages between Amanda and someone named Jake. The tone was casual, but laced with affection. The exchanges grew more intimate as he scrolled, with Jake referencing private jokes and plans for their next escape. One email attached a photo of Amanda wearing the bracelet, her smile radiating joy. Its heart sank. It wasn't just a fling. The correspondence painted a picture of a relationship, one in which Amanda seemed fully invested. To complete his investigation, Nick turned to her credit card statements again. This time, he noticed a pattern in the locations of her charges, all within a specific radius. With a few clicks, he mapped out their likely meeting spots. An expensive cafe, a quiet park, and the high-info restaurant he'd seen them at the night before. As he stared at the map, Nick felt a mix of rage and determination. Amanda's betrayal of the master entirely, and Heron felt so adrift, Nick was ready to jump off the top of a giant cliff so he could be with her and get a flyaway. Amanda's words kept coming to him, and his baby brother now felt tainted. Still, he wasn't ready to act impulsively. Nick needed to maintain the element of surprise. He compiled all his evidence, the receipts, photos, emails, and text messages, into a secure folder on his laptop. The truth was in his hands now, and with it, the power to dictate the next steps. For the moment, Nick kept his composure, playing the role of a loving husband while planning the confrontation that would lay Amanda's lies bare. In the evening, Amanda came home after another late night. Nick sat in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table, a glass of whiskey untouched by his side. He'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head, but now that it was upon him, his nerves hummed with tension. He reminded himself that the evidence he'd painstakingly gathered left no room for denial. Tonight, he would expose the truth. Amanda entered the house with a breezy smile, carrying a reusable grocery bag filled with items she'd likely picked up to sell the illusion of her alibi. "Hey, babe," she called out, kicking off her shoes by the door. "Hey," Nick replied, keeping his tone neutral. He watched her place the bag on the counter and rummage through it, pulling out fresh produce and a bottle of wine. She moved with the ease of someone whose life was perfectly intact, entirely unaware of the storm about to descend. "Want me to cook something tonight?" she asked over her shoulder, already reaching for a skillet. Nick leaned back in his chair, studying her, the woman he'd loved for nearly a decade who now felt like a stranger. "We need to talk," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Amanda hesitated, her hand pausing mid-reach for the stove knob. She turned to face him, her expression flickering with confusion and a touch of wariness. "What's wrong?" "Sit down," Nick said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Amanda obeyed, her movements slower now, her eyes scanning his face for clues. "You're scaring me," she said with a nervous laugh. Nick opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. The first image displayed was of her sitting at the restaurant with Jake, the bracelet gleaming on her wrist. Amanda's face drained of color. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his tone cold. For a moment, Amanda said nothing, her mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. Nick clicked to the next image, the close-up of her hand resting on Jake's, their fingers intertwined. "Really? Because this looks pretty clear to me," he said. Amanda's composure began to crack. Her hands trembled as she wrung them together. "Don't insult me," he interrupted sharply. "I've seen the receipts, Amanda. The bracelet, the dinners, the hotels. I read your emails to Jake. I know everything." The room seemed to shrink around them. Amanda's breathing quickened as her mind raced, searching for a way to salvage the situation. I can explain," she stuttered. "Go ahead," Nick said, leaning forward. "I'm listening." Tears welled in her eyes as she began to speak. "It didn't mean anything, I swear. I don't know, I was lonely. You've been so busy with work, and I felt invisible. Jake was he noticed me, Nick, that's all it was. A stupid mistake." Nick stared at her, his jaw tight. "A mistake?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Amanda, this wasn't a one-time thing. This was calculated, planned. You lied to me for months." I refuse. I refused. I didn't want to hurt you," she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks now. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Nick felt his chest tighten, but he refused to let her tears soften him. "You didn't want to hurt me," he said bitterly. "Amanda, every time you came home and looked me in the eyes, you hurt me. Every lie you told, every night you spent with him instead of me." Amanda reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Please, Nick," she pleaded. "I love you. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. I'll end it with Jake. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us." Nick stood, pacing the room to burn off the anger surging through him. "Don't give up on us?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You already gave up on us, the moment you decided he was more important than your vows. This wasn't just about Jake, Amanda. It's about trust, respect, everything our marriage was built on. You've destroyed all of it." Amanda sobbed quietly, her face buried in her hands. For a brief moment, Nick felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of her betrayal. He returned to his seat and reached for the manila folder beside his laptop. "This," he said, sliding the folder across the table, "is a copy of the divorce papers I filed today." Amanda's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with shock. "Nick, no, please. Don't do this. We can fix it. I'll prove to you that I can change." Nick shook his head, his expression resolute. "It's too late for that. I gave you everything, Amanda. I trusted you, and you chose to throw it all away." Amanda sat frozen, her sobs now replaced with stunned silence. Nick stood and walked to the door, grabbing his coat. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight. You can use this time to figure out where you'll be living, because you're not staying here." As he stepped outside into the cool night air, Nick felt an odd mixture of grief and relief. The life he thought he knew was over, but so was the deception. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of clarity. The truth had set him free, and now he could begin to rebuild. The fallout began the very next morning. Nick woke early in his hotel room, the weight of the previous night pressing down on him. The world outside seemed oblivious to the storm in his life, sunlight streaming through the curtains as if nothing had changed. But everything had. He stared at his phone for a long moment, hesitating. Amanda's betrayal had felt like a private wound, one he wasn't sure he wanted to expose. But the more he thought about the months of deceit, the lies she'd so easily woven into their shared life, the more he realized this wasn't just his burden to bear. Her actions had rippled through their family, their friends, their shared social circles, and Nick decided it was time the truth came to light. After a quick shower, Nick sat down at the small hotel desk and began compiling his evidence. The photos, emails, and receipts were all neatly categorized, and he attached them to an email addressed to Amanda's parents and closest friends. He wrote carefully, choosing his words with precision. Subject: Amanda's betrayal. Dear, I'm writing this not out of spite, but to shed light on the truth. For months, Amanda has been involved in an affair with another man. This isn't speculation. I have undeniable proof, which I've attached here. I felt it was only fair that you know the real reason our marriage is ending. I hope this helps. You understand the choices I'm now forced to make. Sincerely, Nick. After clicking send, Nick felt a strange mix of liberation and unease. He didn't enjoy airing his personal pain, but he knew Amanda's carefully cultivated image as a loving wife would now face the scrutiny it deserved. Better yet, that afternoon, the ripple effects of his email began to take shape. Amanda's parents, James and Linda, were the first to call. Their voices were a mix of shock, sorrow, and, surprisingly, anger. Not at Nick, but at their daughter. Nick, Linda said, her voice trembling. I don't even know what to say. We had no idea she was capable of this. I didn't either, Nick admitted, his tone heavy with sadness. But I thought you deserved to know. Linda hesitated. What happens now? I've filed for divorce, Nick replied. I can't see a way forward from this. James spoke up then, his voice firm. We understand. And Nick, for what it's worth, we're on your side. Amanda's actions are inexcusable. Their support was a small comfort, but it didn't erase the pain. Word spread quickly. Friends began reaching out, offering support or expressing disbelief. Amanda's closest friend, Jenna, called in tears, her voice filled with guilt. I knew she'd been acting distant, but I had no idea, Jenna confessed. Nick, I'm so sorry. If I'd known, I would have said something. It's not your fault, Jenna, Nick assured her. This is on Amanda. Later that evening, Nick learned that Jake's partner, a longtime girlfriend Nick hadn't known about, had also received the evidence. Amanda's betrayal wasn't confined to one life. It had spilled over into Jake's as well. The girlfriend's response came swiftly and publicly. She posted a scathing message on social media, tagging Amanda and Jake. To those who hide behind lies and fake loyalty, the truth always comes out. Amanda and Jake, enjoy the chaos you've created. You deserve each other. Nick read the post with grim satisfaction, knowing it wasn't just his life Amanda had disrupted. The next few days were a whirlwind of confrontation and fallout. Amanda called repeatedly, her messages veering between anger and desperation. How could you humiliate me like this? She screamed during one call. You've destroyed my reputation. Nick's response was cold and unwavering. No, Amanda. You destroyed your own reputation the moment you decided to betray me. I only exposed the truth. Her tone shifted then, softening into a pleading desperation. Nick, please. I made a mistake. We can fix this together. But Nick had heard enough. I've already made my decision, Amanda. You need to accept that. Amanda's friends began to distance themselves from her. Social gatherings grew tense with whispers following her wherever she went. Jake wasn't spared either. His professional reputation took a hit as his indiscretions became common knowledge. For Nick, the exposure was both cathartic and exhausting. It didn't erase the pain, but it provided clarity, a way to reclaim his dignity and rebuild his life without the weight of lies. One evening, Jenna stopped by the hotel where Nick was staying. She handed him a small envelope. What's this? Nick asked. A letter from Amanda, Jenna said. She asked me to give it to you. She said it's her last attempt to explain. Nick hesitated before opening it. The letter was a rambling mix of apologies, justifications, and desperate pleas for forgiveness. It read her not the funnest to read, but it had begun with a death toll. Mick, I know I've hurt you, and I know I've lost your trust. Nick folded the letter and placed it on the desk, untouched. Amanda's words felt hollow against the weight of her actions. That night, as he stared out the window at the city lights, Nick felt a sense of resolve. The exposure had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Now it was time to focus on the next chapter of his life, a chapter free of deception and filled with the possibility of healing. The days following the confrontation and exposure brought a strange sense of clarity to Nick's life. For the first time in months, he no longer felt the weight of uncertainty or suspicion. The truth, as painful as it had set him on a new path, one where his dignity and self-worth took precedence over the shards of a broken relationship. Nick moved into a small, furnished apartment not far from his office. It was temporary, a way to give himself space to think and heal. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, but it felt like a sanctuary. Simple and honest, without the shadow of Amanda's lies. He spent his first morning there sipping coffee on the small balcony, the crisp air filling his lungs. As he looked out over the city, he reflected on how far he had come in just a few weeks. He had been blindsided, betrayed, and heartbroken, but he had also emerged stronger. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel pride in how he had handled the ordeal. The divorce proceedings began quietly but efficiently. Nick's evidence left little room for argument, and Amanda quickly agreed to the terms, perhaps realizing there was no way to fight him on solid ground. Despite the hurt she had caused, Nick chose not to be vindictive. "I don't want revenge," he told his lawyer. "I just want this to be over so I can move on." Amanda's lawyer approached with an offer of mediation, but Nick declined. "There's nothing to mediate," he said firmly. "The marriage is over." The legal process took a few months, but it moved steadily. By the end, Nick walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter, as though he had finally set down a burden he had been carrying for far too long. Amanda's absence brought its own kind of silence, one that Nick welcomed. He rediscovered small joys he had forgotten. Afternoons spent reading a good book, taking long walks in the park, or losing himself in the rhythm of his favorite jazz records. He even started cooking again, something he had once loved but had let fall by the wayside during his marriage. His friends rallied around him, pulling him back into social circles he had neglected. One Friday night, over beers with his oldest friend Kevin, Nick opened up about the ordeal. "I don't know how you held it together," Kevin said, shaking his head. "If it had been me, I don't think I could have handled it so calmly." Nick gave a small smile. "It wasn't easy, but what kept me going was the realization that her betrayal didn't define me. It was her failure, not mine." Kevin nodded thoughtfully, raising his glass. "Here's to new beginnings." "Then, to new beginnings," Nick echoed. One of the most unexpected parts of the aftermath was the support Nick received from Amanda's parents. Despite the disillusion of their marriage, James and Linda reached out often, offering words of encouragement and even inviting him over for dinner. "You still family to us, Nick," Linda said one evening over coffee. "We're ashamed of what Amanda did, but that doesn't change how we feel about you." Their kindness moved Nick deeply, reminding him that not all connections were severed by Amanda's actions. As months turned into seasons, Nick began to rebuild not just his life, but his sense of self. Therapy sessions helped him untangle the emotional scars left by Amanda's betrayal. He explored the idea of trust, not just in relationships, but in himself. "You trusted her and she broke that trust," his therapist said during one session, "but you also trusted yourself to handle it. And you did. That's a foundation you can build on." Nick took those words to heart. One evening, as Nick walked home from work, he passed a small gallery hosting an art exhibit. Drawn by the warmth of the lights spilling onto the sidewalk, he stepped inside. The room was filled with vibrant paintings and sculptures, each piece a burst of color and emotion. Nick stepped gladly before the idol banner to reach. A woman approached him, her hands tucked into the pockets of a denim jacket. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, gesturing to a painting of a sunlit meadow. Nick nodded. "It feels hopeful," he smiled. "That's what I thought too." They fell into easy conversation, and for the first time in a long while, Nick felt a spark of connection. It was subtle, like the first notes of a song, but it reminded him that life was full of possibilities. As Nick walked back to his apartment that night, he reflected on how much had changed. Amanda's betrayal had been a painful chapter, but it didn't define his story. He had reclaimed his life, rediscovered his strength, and found hope in the simplest moments. The bracelet that had once symbolized deception